ones like to add some more information because I printed out from the YCCU that you all put in?
These are the old ones or the new ones? I'm not sure.
Because that's what I have.
Oh, this, yeah.
I'd probably similar to that, yeah.
Thank you.
You can have one of these.
It's colorful.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good to have a colour printer somewhere.
Oh.
Okay. Oh, Jung, do they have
Yeah, I have one.
pen? Oh, you have one for the board, yeah. Sorry, it's all never enough equipment around. Okay. Thank you. Right, so you've just about finished your course in accounting theory. I hope you found it very interesting, and with this knowledge, what I expect you to be able to do is to go out and advise people. That could be advising a business, a company, a director, a shareholder. It could be advising a government agency. So you are now skilled and knowledgeable about the theory and the practice of business management, and particularly have an insight into accounting theory. And so what we'll be aiming for in this course in terms of the examination is your ability to be able to use the information and knowledge from this course to advise people. That's all accountants do essentially. They provide advice to, as I said, to a whole range of clients, and you need to be able to deal with any one of those. That could be a member of the general public or someone who's not skilled in accounting. So it could be a general shareholders or some group like that, where you're going to need to be able to take your knowledge of accounting and give those people an insight into what you know. Likewise, you could be asked to advise the chief financial officer of a company or someone who's highly knowledgeable about accounting, what they need to know, or some alternative options on what they might need to do in a particular situation. So when you prepare for your exams at the end of this course, they're the kind of things I want you to put into your forefront. So today we're going to talk about corporate governance, and this is really a topic to bring most of the work that you've done, not only in your accounting program, but probably throughout your business course together. Because at the end of the day, there's a sort of triumvirate of issues that we're going to focus on. Now, I talked a little bit about those with you previously, but we see governance as the sort of central, or as a key part of that triumvirate of forces. So I'll just talk about the word and the idea behind governance initially, because governance, it doesn't only apply to corporations, it applies to a whole range of different types of organisations. And we talk about governance in public sector life, in not-for-profits and all that. So what do you think the key things are in governance? What are we going to look for? Any ideas? Someone says this organisation has good governance or this one has bad governance. What are some of the things that would distinguish one from another? Have you heard anybody talk about governance before? Is this a new word for you? Someone says there's bad governance. What are some of the things that might have happened?
Maybe it's the corporation or organization is not led properly. I mean, people are not doing their jobs. They don't know what they need to do, what is expected from them. And leaders themselves, maybe they're not open to them. They don't say what they expect from them. Maybe something like that.
Okay, they're all good points. I'll just put them on the side here, by here. So you talked about leadership.
Yeah.
You also talked about communication in there.
Yeah, understanding your role in the company.
understanding roles and things like that. So people knew what was going on, they all had their fair understanding. So they're all really important points that come out. So what are some other things that you might have, someone says there's bad governance in a company or a business or a government or whatever. Or alternatively, think about good. If someone says it's really good, what are they doing that's really good? How,
Well, from accounting side, maybe you could look at those 4 forces that ESB identifies. You gotta be reliable, like your information must be understandable, comparable,
Mm-hmm.
So you gotta do a good job and be a fair worker, because that's what accounting is all about. You've got somebody else's money, but you treat it all fair.
What was that? Sorry, that last part again?
I said, accounting, that's the position where you got somebody else's money usually, and you gotta treat it all fair.
Okay, treat it fair and, yeah, okay. I guess we talk about that as being integrity.
Exactly.
I'll put in here money management. So the accountant's involved with this kind of things, and so when we talk about a breakdown in corporate governance, it often becomes symbolised because there's been a breakdown in money management, usually corruption.
Yeah.
So who's going to take the money? Most likely it's the senior executives of the company. Okay, they're the people who are in a position to commit major fraud. So whenever we have a major corporate collapse or corporate financial crisis, it's often, around this money management issue. That CEOs, CFOs or whatever have been able to create false or misleading information. So quality of information has not been good. They've been able to fool lots of people about what's going on. Maybe make false statements, induce further investments, make statements about the performance of the company that's misleading, have all that approved and checked off, and so there's been a fraud. So that's often the classic case of bad governance. It's epitomised by a breakdown here. But more systematically, it's all of these above. So this is where we can observe it, but it happens because of those things. So it's a bit like a person who gets sick. You've got a particular disease that you maybe contracted in some form. That's going to make you sick or make a company collapse. So we use that analogy. A company will become fatally wounded because it's lost all its money. Then it'll get wound up. That's what kills the company off. But what caused that? Well, it could have been lifestyle. So if we use the health analogy, someone might be smoking and drinking and having a wild lifestyle, and that's going to ultimately cause the disease in the body that will kill you off. So likewise, if you have a reckless, poor management system at the top with poor leadership, poor communication, all of these things going on, that can become symptomatic and lead to money issues. So we can sort of observe these things happening in a number of corporate failures. Often the people who are most likely to end up running out of money for their company are executives who lead very flamboyant, creative lifestyles. And we see a history of these kind of people. They have big parties, they get involved in sporting events, throw money around, they live a pretty entertaining lifestyle. The media loves them. These are all famous people. But in many cases, 5 or 10 years later, they've usually stuffed their companies up. Along the way, people have often been told things about how great the company is, and people just tend to believe it because these leaders are very charismatic people. Now, that's happened over and over again right throughout history. We can go back to the cases, for the last 100 years or more, where business leaders have gone and entertained royalty and presidents and prime ministers and whatnot, build a great big empire. People all trust them, and then their empires or their corporate structures have collapsed. So what we're trying to do with good governance is, make sure all of these things are in place, that we get good leaders, those leaders are accountable, and that there's checks and balances. So when we're looking at a corporate governance or a governance system, there's a system of checks and balances. Now we can talk about that in a political sense, because governance is a more broader concept, but politically speaking we talk about governance that gets out of balance when leaders, particularly we would call them maybe dictators or people like that, assume too much power. There's nothing else to counterbalance those leaders. And so, not that any political system is perfect, but in most democratic systems, there are usually senates and representative chambers. There may be presidents and prime ministers. There are different balancing positions of power within the political systems. So likewise, when we look at corporate structures, we look at usually a split leadership, where we can talk about a CEO and a chairperson of an organisation as being two separate people. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the two roles get combined. We get the CEO and chair being the one person. Again, that is seen as being risky. So good corporate governance will make sure we've got two people, at least two people at the top, to balance each other out. And we see that, as I said, in political systems. Most political systems in Australia, we have a Governor-General and we have a Prime Minister to notionally balance those conflicts of interest out. And in other countries, we have presidents or senators or various other groups to run those sort of balances. Communication is really an essential part of good corporate governance. People need to know what's going on. That builds trust. People have confidence. But what are we communicating? We need to make sure that information is reliable, that it's checked off, we've got quality of the information. So we're going to need to look at how do we design systems of corporate governance to give us the best type of information. Now, that's where our accounting standards come in, our auditing standards. But when we look at corporate governance, it's not just the standard, it's how we implement that standard. What are the steps that are in place there? And through leadership and through good communication, we'll have both internal and external stakeholders in the organisation. So all the different people and groups or committees or structures that are put up need to have clear roles, need to have clear statements of their duties and their responsibilities. So they all get counterbalanced. And the outcome of all of these sorts of things is that we should have minimised the opportunity for mismanagement. So we talked about the agency problem, conflicts there. We know there are inherent conflicts in any organisation. There are lots of people, and we assume that most people are going to act in their own self-interest. So there's always going to be a temptation for people to mismanage, or if there's opportunities, to access other people's money. Now that can be done in obviously fairly sophisticated ways. It's not, doesn't mean you go out with your dark glasses on and rob the bank and take all the money out. When a CEO or an executive might be accessing that money, that could be through their share, through their executive remuneration or payments. They pay themselves more money. So how do we control the executive remuneration? We saw, and I talked to you last time about regulation, particularly about some of these issues. And most of the research that we're looking at now shows that after the global financial crisis, one of the contributing factors that people said was many executives had contracts for their remuneration that incentivised them to take greater and greater risk. So they were, more or less, particularly in the banking and finance industries, gambling, that they gambling with the shareholders' money to leverage up the returns because they would be paid bonuses based on those returns. And we know that the salaries of and bonuses of the major bankers were usually in the tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars per year, and in a few cases were even more than $1 billion a year. So people were being individual executives were being paid huge amounts of money to gamble and incentivise themselves using the financial resources. So it wasn't just straight out stealing, although that has happened in the past, but modern corporate corruption, or in a sense, is usually linked to the incentive structures. So good governance is going to sort of try and control the executive remuneration and compensation. That's going to be a key part of an organisation's corporate governance system. Now, the latest data that we've seen is that although the incentives for executives dropped significantly in 2008 after the 2007 financial crisis, by 2011, certainly to end of 2010, 2011, we know that many of the top fund managers now are earning incomes back above what they were. So that dip in executive compensation only happened for a few years. So the top hedge fund managers last year globally were earning personally $5 billion plus US dollars. So huge amounts of income still going to senior executives in the finance industry. And that raises a lot of questions about the long-term sustainability of the financial systems, particularly our banking and finance systems globally, where more and more of the shareholders' resources are being devoted to the executive management and compensation. Now, what we want to do is build on this governance, and I talked about a triumvirate of elements, and basically what we want out of good governance, and good governance is going to do two things. One, it's going to enable the organisation to look forward, and the other one's going to be basically the backward-looking step, which is your reporting and your reward systems. So we've got two things two elements that feed off this. And that's performance and strategy. They're the those three things together, in my view, are the core elements of any organisation's systems and operations. Everything else really underpins or falls off these things. So governance is what we're going to do is concentrate on that, but we need to keep this in mind. Who sets the strategy for any organisation, which is your forward-looking direction, is the board of directors. The chairman or chairperson of a company will be strategising and working with consultants and others to understand their industry, their risks, their environment, etc., to build a corporate strategy, to position their entity, to set the risk profile for the business, etc. And so we look at that, and then what we've got then is a governance system that's going to monitor and manage the performance of the business. So this is what actually gets done, and to make sure that's all heading in that direction of that strategy. Now these things then, we'll move this around in a circular fashion, constantly moving. So corporate strategy is not something that's written and stuck in a cupboard and pulled out every 12 months. How's it going? It's a living thing. Corporate governance is dynamic and living. It's constantly responding to challenges. And corporate performance is again one of these things that's going to be constantly reviewed. So we're going to look at those sorts of dimensions. So we can look at this, and I use an acronym here, GPS. We sort of play on those words, Global Positioning System, but that's what it is. So if you can remember it, governance, performance, strategy. They're the building blocks for any good business, and you can business governance system. They're the things that are going to be the building blocks for making it happen. So what we want to do is really now go through and look at all these things. What are the checks and balances that we have in place? How do we define governance? How do we define performance? How do we measure performance? What are the different rules that we've got? How do we assure that the performance that we are measuring is correct, is not being manipulated by management, or minimise that manipulation? And then look at the strategic positioning of companies and where they're trying to head. So that, as I said, that's going to be in terms of their risk, predominantly their risk profiles position, their position within a market, what kind of, whether they're a leader in a market, price leader, price taker, innovator. There's a lot of strategic issues around strategy and corporate positioning, and then how that is built then back through the governance system, because the positioning will influence the kinds of people who will get involved in the governance. So keep in mind that governance is going to involve not just the direct participants like shareholders, but a whole range of other indirect participants in organisations, such as community groups, social groups, a whole range of things. And we see constantly a lot of debate, and you've talked about some of those in environmental, social reporting issues, the ESG type stuff. So we talk about environmental, social issues. Now, all of those things also tie back into strategy performance. What are we going to reward our executives for? What are the key variables and drivers? Now, that could be based on actual performance through production or sales or some sort of market share, but it also could be involved on some strategic dimensions, such as being able to eliminate or take over competitors in your industry, or to vertically integrate your corporation. So we know some CEOs and some organisations, particularly CEOs, get rewarded on their ability to move their company through strategic profiles, and that's going to be their core performance goal. It's not necessarily production or sales, but through leveraging their assets and then being able to acquire other businesses. So some companies become quite aggressive takeover operators. So that's a sort of broad picture of what we're going to look at. We'll have a quick look at, I'll just move on to the second slide. So we've talked significantly about giving you some ideas about corporate governance and some of the issues there. As I said, I want you to be able to think in your own minds clearly about what is good corporate governance, what are the characteristics. So if you came into a business, you would be able to say these are the things that a business should be able to identify and have if it's got a good system of corporate governance. Now, there's a lot of fine-tuning in all of that, and a lot of issues. So then we'll have a look at the OECD principles of corporate governance, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and then I want to look at some of these core parts of corporate governance, particularly what directors and boards of directors do, and then look at the roles of different types of directors, executive, non-executive, the role of the audit committee, and the remuneration committee, board and executive remuneration. Now, these are all areas, these last four, that have all gone under a lot of reform in the last 10 or 20 years globally. Now, we can see there's a couple of dimensions here. One is that in the last few decades, the growth of the corporation has really been widespread or ubiquitous around the world, but many governments and countries didn't have rules and regulations for corporate governance. So this is where the OECD has become involved, as well as groups like the IMF, the World Bank and others. The OECD principles are seen as sort of the starting point for good corporate governance. Now, good corporate governance assumes that there is a pretty strong infrastructure within a country to support corporate development. So that means that you've got a well-developed accounting profession with auditors, accounting education, lots of opportunities for experience and training. You've got a strong audit profession with a lot of education and training and development around auditors. You've got good legal systems, independent judiciary, that you've got a government agencies or regulatory agencies, and we talked about those when we looked at regulations such as ASIC or the Securities Exchange Commission in the US and groups like that are going to monitor and manage the regulatory environment, that you have a well-developed pool of independent or non-executive directors who are not tied up with companies. So when we look at all of these principles and start to think about all the things that you need under an OECD principle to get this kind of outcome, you're really looking at a well-developed economy, a modern, developed economy. So one of the big challenges has been in emerging markets, particularly newly emerging and developing economies in Asia, Africa, South and Central America. A lot of these things are missing or are only very recently developed, even in Eastern Europe and places like that. So a lot of resources are being spent through the World Bank, through IMF and other groups, trying to promote the development of the institutions that enable good corporate governance to exist. Why do the developed world countries want this to happen? Predominantly, it enables investors in developed economies to have confidence in the investments they may be making in emerging markets. And we know that when we look at the global investment trends, and many of the developed economies in even more recent times are following the GFC, have flat, or in many cases declining economic growth in Europe, North America, etc. So where are the major investment opportunities? They have, and they're going to be more likely in the emerging and developing economies. The economic growth of many of those economies, China, India, others, has been 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% or more per year. Some are even higher. So investors from the developed world are making major investments in these economies. They've been pressuring these countries for improved corporate governance. So we've seen this global pressure evolve. Now, it's, in my view, again, a sort of form of neo-imperialism, that a lot of these ideas happens every time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I've only done it twice, but it's 100% straight. Oh, that's the time, is it? We've got to wait this to stop, have we, before we can start again? Sorry about that. So I was just talking about some of these ideas about corporate governance and the fact that they're now. Come on. Wait. I got to push more buttons, haven't I? It's not working.
Yeah, wait for it.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. Oh. Thank you, Young. Okay, try again. The key in making corporate governance practices universal is that you have a range of institutional factors in each of the countries in which corporate governance is going to be practiced to be in place. Now that my proposition is that basically that is now not universal. And even in our most developed economies, there are still quite significant differences in the way in which corporate governance is practiced. So although we talk about universal best practice and the way we do it, some is done by regulation, some is done by self-regulation, and some is done through market forces. So in Australia, we have a system that's run through the ASX, the Australian Stock Exchange, for our recommendations on best practice in corporate governance. And a lot of that in Australian way in which we do it is in if not, why not? So we say these are the best things you should do, and if a company doesn't do those, then they should be able to explain why they're not doing them to the market, and then the market can make up its mind. So this goes back to the idea that to keep everybody informed, you should let everybody know what's the best practice of corporate governance, and if someone's doing something different, if they know why, then they can make up their own mind. Does that compromise the risk or increase risk and things like that? So where it's perceived that a company has poor corporate governance, then you'd expect those investments in that company to be seen to be higher risk. So to be what we call a risk premium attached to those securities, either lower share price or higher debt prices for companies with low corporate governance. So the argument is that companies with good corporate governance should, in theory, have better performance. So if you've got good corporate governance, that should lead to some positive outcome here. So we've got a plus, that's a plus sign, a positive relationship between good corporate governance and performance. And people, academics in particular, like to do research. So there's a lot of research where they've gone around and said, you've got all these things, tick, 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 measure them up, and then check out company performance. Is there a strong association or a weak association there? And in many cases, a lot of the research does support this relationship between good corporate governance practices. Now, people then break that down and say, well, let's have a look at these corporate governance practices. Do we have an independent chairperson or separate CEO and chairperson? Okay, that's a positive factor. Do we have a well-developed board structure? Do we have a good audit committees, good remuneration committees? Bang, bang, bang. Look at all those things. Which ones are actually driving performance? How do we get good corporate governance to increase performance? If you've got increased performance, you're going to be, by definition, become more competitive. So strategically, the company becomes stronger in a market sense. And then that becomes a bit of a virtuous circle. And if you've got a good strategy, good performance, you can develop better strategies, you keep your good governance, you get more positive So you've got this virtuous circle going that the company should become stronger through the various cycles it goes through in its review. And consequently, if you have negative attributes in terms of your corporate governance, you'll get, so when it's bad governance up here, you should have a negative relationship down here. Then that relationship will be seen as lowering performance. You're going to have greater risk. The investors will be less likely to support the company. You're going to have lower returns. Your share price will decline. You become more vulnerable to takeover, to an alternative management. It's harder to implement your strategy, and so that becomes one of those circles that is leading eventually to a black hole. Your company is eventually going to get wiped out if that's not corrected. So the key then is, how do you correct it? Well, you try and, most people say, well, the best place to correct is try and improve your governance systems. And if you've got those good, if you can then go from bad to good governance, you can get around. So we need to be able to understand those. Now, there's a lot of evidence, as I said, in many countries, both in developed world and in the emerging markets, where we've done research, both academic and corporate research, to try and identify that. And so investors are pretty tuned in now. They know, we'll look at the governance variables. If they're strong, we've got better signals to invest. Then it's a matter of balancing risk and reward and those sorts of things. Good companies with good governance are probably going to have the best people. So building a good corporate board is very similar to, say, building a good football team or something like that. They've all got to work together. We've all got to come together at the table, at the board table, to run that company. If you've got a dysfunctional board, divided board, that's another good signal that you've got risks in your in your corporation, and investors move away. So they're signals, early warning signals of a possible financial issue is board conflict. And board disharmony leads to loss of investor confidence or market confidence in general, maybe difficulty to renegotiate your debts and various other things, breakdown in your linkages. So that's the model that we've got, and that's why these things are going to happen, that we're going to go through and look at all of those things. And the million-dollar question is, which bits of this really work? And in a sense, it's a bit like an all or nothing, So if you've got good governance, you've either got it. If you haven't got it, well, you can't say, well, we've got a good leader, but we've got a bad audit committee. Well, it doesn't quite work like that. You've got to have every bit working, It's like, as I said, the football team. You can't say, I've got a great goalkeeper, but we've got no fullback, so everyone else can kick the goals through the football, win the game or lose the game. So you need every player on the team. You can't just have one or two stars. And likewise in corporate governance, you've got to have all the bits in the puzzle working together. Have a few bits missing or have one bit missing, it's probably going to undermine the quality of the whole activity. Has anyone got any questions about any of those things? You've got a pretty good understanding? So you all get hired now by a company. You've got the chairman says, look, we've got problems. We've got an audit committee that's can't agree on the audit, terms and conditions of the audit. What are you going to tell them?
Go for it.
Why?
Well, if you've got a committee, of course, you just deliver a plan. What's wrong? What you need to improve? I mean, where are you heading at? What do you actually expect? What do you want with that whole thing to so just get that plan and then work on it.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to look at this in a little while, but I just gave you the example of an audit committee not being able to select an auditor. Now, one of Okay, so you've got an audit committee. Audit committee,
Okay.
you've got normally good governance. Okay, so we've got a board of directors. We're going to come and have a look at all this in a moment, so I jumped ahead a bit, but so you've got a board. Board of directors. Now, they're the people who run the organisation, and the question is, who should be on that board? That's our first starting point. Now, who would you want on the board of directors? You're a shareholder. Do you get to say on this? Who picks the board of directors? Don't know?
I think stakeholder.
Shareholders, okay, yeah. So in pretty well all legislation around the world, the shareholders of a business, a corporation, are the sole people responsible for selecting or nominating the directors of a company. So this goes back to our discussion about stakeholders. Shareholders have a unique position, and that is they determine the directors of the company. And the corporate law makes that relationship inviolate, that the shareholders elect the directors, the directors then report back to the shareholders. Now we talk about stewardship. Shareholders have put their money, they're the people who put money invested in the company. And the directors are looking after that money on their behalf. And then we sort of simplify that under agencies and we talk about the managers. But directors are the key people, the boards of directors. So we've got a board of directors. Now there's a whole lot of issues about who gets on the board of directors. Now, who would you want on the board of directors if you're a shareholder? You just want me to go down to Coles and grab 100 or 10 people and say you can be the director of the company? You want me? Who would you like to be on there? Your mum? You want her to get on
She
there?
wants it herself to be on the
You want to be on there? Yeah, okay, put your hand up. Why would you want to be on there? What would you want?
Because you're motivated to be on the board.
Any ideas? What kind of people are normally directors of companies? Speak up, sorry.
I think the financial experts.
Financially qualified? Okay, that might be one type of people, yeah. You want someone who knows about finance, yeah.
Who've got experience in the market, who know their company, who know what kind of life cycles the companies are now.
Okay, so you want someone with experience and knowledge. Now, if you're going to know about the company, you're talking about executives or are you talking about somebody else? Maybe, okay. That's fine. So you want someone with finance, you want someone who could be an executive. Who would you want on the company?
Can do the job, specific job to good for the company.
Okay, you want someone who can do a
Maybe
good
like
job, yeah?
for audit committee, like head, it should be maybe somebody from outside, not from within the company. If
Okay.
for audit.
Okay. Now you've all made good points, so I'm not criticising any of you, but the board of directors is the overall governing board. It represents all of the shareholders.
Yeah.
And so you want people on the board, and I'll put down here, we'll just board of directors down here. So you're going to want someone on there clearly who knows the business. Now, the people who know the business are most likely going to be executives. Aren't they? They know the business. They've been out there. They know who's in the market, what they've got to sell. They know how to make the goods or what the deals. They know everything about it. So you're going to have some of those kind of people in there, aren't you?
Of course, but it doesn't mean that they know, because there is an issue that things aren't working properly. So there is something else missing, not just knowledge about the company.
Okay, and what's that? What's the missing bit?
Well, maybe it's how to say that, self-orientation or whatever, how's that? They are looking benefits for themselves, maybe they are more motivated for their own benefit, not for the company.
That's executives, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a risk, haven't we? If we've got
Yeah.
executives only, or majority of executives, they have the inside knowledge. They've got this big chance to manipulate things, to make things.
Yeah,
Well-
so that's why we need audit committee.
Yeah, eventually we'll get there. We haven't got there yet. You like these audit committees.
Yeah.
We're going to get there. Okay, so we need other people to balance. So we talk about these as the non-executives. And these are going to be your other experts. And it could be a finance person, could be an engineer, could be an international banker. You run a global business, you want maybe someone who's an expert in European markets, someone who's an expert in Asia or Chinese markets, someone in American markets. So you might have some people with good insight and knowledge. You may also have a business that's pretty highly involved with government, maybe a lot of government contracting. So you might get some politicians who've retired from government to come and work in your company. So all of these kind of people who've got expertise, knowledge, networks, whether it's finance, law, government, military contacts. If you're in the military complex, a lot of generals and people, senior ex-military officials, get into business. And they normally form this pool of non-executive directors, or independent, we sometimes call them independent directors. And so we'll look at all those. So we want a board that's going to be made up of some people who know their business. So we normally have the chief executive of any organisation is a member of its board, and there may be one or two others. But we don't want the majority of the board to be executives. And so we're going to look for the balance of the board. Now, when we look at a board too, we're going to see this is going to deal with lots of different interest groups, isn't it? You've got shareholders, you've got employees, you've got maybe social environmental groups, you've got bankers, you've got to negotiate with a lot of different organisations. The board's the main group. So one of the big things that we're focusing on, and we do focus on now, diversity of the board. Now that's the euphemism for that your board has gender representation. That you've got enough women on board seats. Now we know in Australia, very low, less than 10% of corporate boards that have women, or less than 10% of corporate board membership of our top companies comprises females. Other countries, for example in Norway I think, and some of the other countries in the north, have legislation.
Yes.
They've actually got a law that says you've got to have 40% or 50% of your board has to comprise women. In the US, they've been not only concerned about women, they've also been concerned about race. So you need to have sufficient number of blacks or Hispanics or different ethnic groups. So the board should cover a broad racial composition. There are other elements too. One of the things that we know, if you are a board member in pretty well most of the countries of the world, you're going to be probably 50 years or older. Now that may come about because you've got to have a fair bit of experience, but most corporate boards, very few, have young people. Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook is probably one of the exceptions of being relatively young. I think he's in his early 30s now. But many company boards comprise predominantly males older than 50. So young, youth and diversity there. So when we talk about diversity, it's often fairly narrowly interpreted, usually about gender. And people then look at a board, and there's been a lot of research studied, good corporate governance, how many women are on boards. If we've got more women on corporate boards, if that's good, does that lead to positive performance? So we can do that kind of thing. And there's some indication that's the case, that the more women you have on boards, that generally has a positive outcome on financial and other performance measures. So we've looked at these kind of things, at board factors. Now once we've got this board of people, question is, how many do you want? Do you want me to go down to town and get 50 people, 100 people? Is that going to be a good board? Do we want 2 people, 10 people, 5 people?
Depends on the companies and what's gonna be done,
Yeah.
but definitely not 50.
Definitely, oh, you're saying definitely not fair. You got a number in mind, you know? You have any ideas? Okay, generally, historically there are different types of boards, but you know, some boards are generally, historically we had boards with large numbers of people. That's particularly for boards that became representative, a bit like political organisations. You know, we have 100, 200, 500 people in parliaments or governments around the world because we want someone from this area, this area, this area. So everybody gets to, you know, you get a big a number of people in government. And some boards used to go like this. They say, oh, we need someone from there, there, there. Well, they become unworkable. They really are unworkable. So in order to have successful boards, we know that the relationship looks, and if we graph it, something like that, where, so say we've got 0 board members and we've got maybe 15 up here, so 7 or something like that's in the middle. Basically the best boards tend to be about 7, less maybe 5 to 9 people, you know, if we sort of took that range here from 5 to 9. So even for really big companies, the big global corporations, you usually don't see many of those have more than about 9 members. Now, there are different structures in different countries, and we're predominantly going to look at the Anglo-American model here, where we actually have a single board. We just have one board in the Anglo-American worldview. Okay, we have a single, what we call a unitary board, does everything. Now, in Europe, in particular, what's the continental sort of legal tradition, corporate structure there is for a unitary board. And in the dual board systems, we normally have a representative type board and an executive or management board. We have 2 boards. These representative boards in countries like Germany, France, and other places can be quite large. They'll normally have specific representation from trade unions, from creditors, from bankers, and various other groups. So those representative boards become quasi-political, and then they have an executive or management board, and so you've got that interaction between 2 boards. Now that's been picked up in some of our emerging markets. For example, in Indonesia, the Indonesian corporate legislation has a dual board structure. So they've adopted European type management systems, but in other countries we have a single, this single board, this Anglo-American sort of single board. We just have one board of directors. So in Japan, we tend to have this, but the Japanese boards tend to have, again, quite large numbers of members. So different countries have quite different practices. And of course in countries like China, the board structures also get compounded through political representation, including our party members and people like that in the board, particularly where there's state-owned enterprises, and the party has usually a big say in who gets on the board anyway. So different board structures around the world. So we've got the OECD saying, okay, we're going to have one set of unifying global principles, but we're starting to see now there's no such thing. The more we drill into it, the more every country does its own thing. And so when I came to you earlier on and said Australia has a system for corporate governance of, if not, why not? That's our sort of motto here. We'll tell you these are the basic things you should have. If you don't do it, you should disclose to the market. Now again, not every company bothers to disclose. And a lot of these rules and regulations are seen as quite onerous. So many companies object. So we're not doing that. We're not going to do that. And unless there's actual government regulation or legislation, they won't do it. Now that's come up, and you'll see from time to time in the media this issue of diversity. Now I think our federal government at the moment's got a fair bit on its plate, but every now and again our Attorney General, who's Nicola Roxon, she will come out and say we need more corporate executives. Julia Gillard, our Prime Minister, we need more women on company boards. Now that can be political grandstanding. It sounds good, they're making a message, but the Australian government has not at this time said we're going to legislate. We're going to actually force you to have, half your board as women, or even 25%, or whatever number they might pick. So they let companies make their own mind up, and then they try and name and shame them. Say, oh, this company didn't appoint any women, or da da da, and they try and hassle the company. So our approach in Australia has been less interventionist, less regulatory. But as I mentioned, in other countries, the government will write the law and say, you're a company, you must have half your board members should be women. Now we know in the case of Norway, which is one of the countries, I think it's got officially about 45% of all board seats are women. One of the issues that came up, and has come up with this legislative intervention, is who's going to sit on the board. So you come up with a law that says we want diversity, and for instance we want a minimum of any gender at 40%. So you could have a 60-40 split or a 50-50 or whatever within that range. So you say this is the minimum target. You still got to go and find the people to sit there. Are you going to get them from your executive pool? Well, they're probably all men. So you've got to go out and grab some non-execs. Now we know what happens in Norway. There are not enough women directors. So what happens? The same women, some women sit on 50 or 100 boards. They can't possibly do it. But the company can tick the box. Oh yes, we've met the target. And that's the problem with this kind of mandatory thing. There is not enough people who've met the criteria for the shareholders to vote. That's assuming, because keep in mind the government can regulate this, so you want 40%, but the government don't pick who the board members are. It's the shareholders. They've got to say, we want you, you and you on the board. They've got to vote for them. Okay? So they need to find people who are good in finance, know the industry, have the international contacts. So one of the big risks of legislating about board membership is that you don't actually get it right. Or if you do get it right, it becomes self-serving. And Norway can run around and say, yes, we're the best, we've got 40%. But of those women, most of the women are on extreme numbers of boards, which means that they're unlikely to do a good job on any single one of them. Because we know that to be an effective board member is very time consuming. Okay? Probably going to take you several days in each month of committed work. So many companies actually restrict in Australia. Many of our directors who are professional directors will sit on maybe 3, 4, 5 boards. That's their job. So they've got 3 or 4 or 5 companies they work on. They're not going to sit on 10, 20, 30. They can't do it. They can't do a good enough job for any single company that way. So our high-profile directors that do sit on multiple boards usually, and many of the boards themselves will say, we only want, we'll restrict the number of boards on which you sit as a director. And so this is another issue that needs to be looked at. So board, getting on the board, running the company, that's the core. Now when it comes to getting a board working together, I talked about the football team earlier. And basically a football team is a good analogy because the board has to work together. And I've sat down with a number of companies, a number of corporate boards, talking to directors about who gets on the board, how does it work, how do you make decisions? And there's a lot of research. The Australian Research Council is funding a lot of corporate governance research at the moment, looking into corporate structures and corporate boards. What makes a high-performing board? So if we've got a board of directors, and we're going to have this circle here through performance and out through strategy and back again, we generally say a high-performance board is one obviously gets high performance out of the company. So what makes it actually work? How do they reach decisions? How do those decisions get implemented? How effective are they? How do they, turn their strategy into action? That's the key. And understanding the kinds of discussion that goes on. So you're going to have somewhere between 7, maybe 8, 9 people, between 5 and 9 people in a room, sitting around a table, taking a company forward. You need to have those people working together. You'll obviously want some vigorous debates. You don't want everybody just saying, yeah, we agree with the chairperson or whatever. You want some tension, but you don't want it to become disharmonious. So you don't want conflict. That will just, destroy the board. You need to have the board focused to be able to reach decisions. So you need to have good, what we call a good chairmanship or a good leader who can work through the agendas, get the decisions, make the strategies, get those things done. So you've got to have that right combination of good leadership skills, good communication skills within the board, good teamwork skills, and clear delegations of all the responsibilities of the different board members. So those board members can bring into the company their skill sets. They could be financial skill sets, they could be market access skill sets. And a lot of, one of the key criteria for most board members is their ability to have great networks. So all of these people who are executive directors, we always joke about people getting out on the golf course and playing games of golf. And they say, but everyone says, well, that's where 90% of the world's business is done. It's on a golf course because they've got their connections. They go to the golf club, they play the game of golf, they talk to everybody, they work out their deals. They're probably playing a game of golf with a banker, a financier, a lawyer, somebody else. They can say, oh, okay, we've got access to this money, we can do this deal, we can get into this market, we can sign a contract with this company, we can, do a merger, acquisition, or whatever it is. So it's these directors and their ability to network, to find particularly sources of finance, to find opportunities in new markets and new products and those sorts of things. That's what the board's going to do, and that's going to feed back into its strategy setting process. So it's a very dynamic thing, and particularly with international business today, it's also having the capacity to enter into new markets, to have that inside knowledge to get to foreign markets and things like that. So we see a lot of interest now. I talked about diversity of boards, but particularly in America being race and in Australia and Europe being predominantly focused on gender. But it's also what I call the internationalisation of the board. So do you have a single board now, or is it made up of people from many different countries? And we see some of particularly the big global multinationals now, they will have a board member in France, one from or France or Germany or somewhere in Europe. They have a North American board member, probably have a South American one. You look at the BHP Billiton board, Marius Kloppers, South African. You've got NASA from the United States. You've got a mixture. So a big Australian multinational company may not even have an Australian on its board. It'll have people from all over the world the best people in the world. I think they appointed, or one was a BHP, had Madeleine Albright, former US Secretary of State, because of access to military and US secrets. Why not have these kind of people? So you're going to get top political people, top industrialists, top commercial people, and occasionally they'll pick, particularly a lot of the US companies will have a Harvard professor or something like that. So Intel, for example, has a Harvard business school professor, and some of the other big companies may have a Harvard or a Yale or a Stanford professor. And in Australia, some of our top corporate boards have university professors, but they would tend to be a very small minority of corporate boards that actually have academics involved in them, and they'll only often have those in specialist cases, so or for industry expertise. So particularly if you're in a scientific or technological industry, maybe defence contracting or IT, that's where you tend to have some high-level scientific or technical knowledge that may come into the corporate board, because you're going to be dealing with certain information that is either extremely sensitive or also very complex, and you need to have some critical analysis of that. So the board and how the board operates, it's the core of all corporate governance. And from that, we can then go on to all these other things like audit committees and things like that. So I hope that's painted a bit of a picture for you about boards. They're really dynamic. They don't just sit there, they're not like a table. When we talk about boards of directors, you probably go, that's boring, I don't know, what do you think, when you hear about boards of directors. But it's real people. These are the so-called the smartest people in the world, or the universe, or whatever, running the companies who are making the goods and services for the consumers of the world. And there's 4,000 or 5,000, not many, the major global public companies. You've probably got 5,000 or 10,000 people who effectively control those major corporate entities. Now, these slides here, and I'll just sort of run through a few of these, then we'll have a break in a little while. But I'll just pick up any points that I haven't sort of covered in those comments. But I think I've tried to paint this picture here for you, which is more important than just sort of reading a whole pile of notes out. Now, the key thing is that, as I mentioned in the first point, stock markets predominantly have been interested. When there's been a decline in the share values, been loss of confidence because we've had corporate failures, HIH in Australia, Enron in America, Lehman Brothers Bank, all these, we can go back, there's lots and lots of those. Generally people have said we've lost confidence, we don't trust the people running our companies, so we've lost confidence in the market. And so the stock markets are all privately owned pretty well. There's a few government ones, but most of the, like the ASX, New York, they're all companies themselves. They have to run on having confidence in their own business. They need integrity in their markets and confidence, so they put pressure. Governments want to keep investors happy because you get a whole pile of unhappy investors. First thing they're going to do is, we need a new government, we'll get you guys, old guys out. So governments are very careful to keep investors and business community happy. So, as I mentioned, poor corporate governance is usually seen as we'll fix up the governance, everything else will be right. So it's easy then, the government can write some laws, pass some regulations, keep everybody happy. Now, it's a central part of accountants' role is, as we talked about, all this information, understanding these stakeholder relationships, so accountants have been pretty much involved. And the last point there is it's everybody. It's not just big companies, although they tend to be the main focus, and nearly all of the rules that have been written have been aimed at these big companies, 5 to 10 sort of type directors, or maybe sometimes a dozen or more, but majority probably in this scale. They're big companies. Now, company directors, we're going to look at remuneration, but, good company directorships are probably in the order of 100,000 to 200 in Australia, 100 to 250,000 is a director's fee. Could be incentive payments. Executives, well, they're going to be anywhere from probably 2 million to 5 million or plus compensation per annum. So there's big financial commitments, but for not-for-profit organisations, charities, other SMEs, they can't afford these kind of things. They can't afford all these structures. So there's been a bit of a disconnect. Most of the stuff's been written for the top companies, not a lot of concern for the smaller companies. And so there's a special interest in how do we get corporate governance for small companies to make it effective for small corporations, and also how do we handle not-for-profits. And this one here, state-owned enterprises. Again, this is a big controversial issue, particularly in a case like Australia, where we're a recipient of huge amounts of foreign investment from China, and you see it in the media all the time. You might probably read it recently. They've got politicians and members of the community saying, we can't trust Chinese companies because they're state-owned, they're controlled by the state, they don't have good corporate governance, they're not independent, rah, rah, rah. So they go straight back to corporate governance, say state-owned enterprises, they don't have this, they don't have independent checks and balances. Who's the main shareholder? The main shareholder who makes the election is the state. They don't necessarily pick the best person, because we know governments aren't going to pick people on quality, they pick them on your political loyalty. You're a good member of this party or that party or whatever, you're going to get that. And it's sometimes jobs for the boys or people in the in-group, you're in that in-group, you got that directorship, So state-owned enterprises don't always have the best reputation for good corporate governance. And so there's been a lot of research looking at corporate governance for state-owned enterprises. No independent directors, all directors are basically picked by the state. Bad corporate governance, bad performance. So do state-owned enterprises. When we get rid of state ownership and we have independent directors, good corporate governance, better performance. One of the big mantras of the last 20, 30 years. Nationalising or privatising state enterprises and breaking up the nationalised industries in the developed and emerging world. Lots of emphasis on that to move from the bad cycle, negative performance, to good, positive performance through eliminating state ownership and therefore state control. And that's sort of the big debate now that I think that's going to come through in China in the next decade or so, particularly as the big Chinese companies become much more international. But that comes up pretty regularly in political discourse in Australia. Now this is just the general definition. I don't expect you to learn any of these things, but you can look at it. It's a set of rules. We talked about that. Relationships. How do we exercise control in corporations? And basically, how do the companies exercise control over their performance, and how they're held to account and report and communicate back to their various interest groups. And it impacts on their objectives, their strategy setting, and it impacts on how we assess and monitor risk. So they're all the elements we've talked about. That's really captured in that sort of definition there. So if you've got an idea of all those concepts that we've talked about in our chart here, you'll understand that definition well. We talked about, in these sort of couple of dot points here, the corporate governance, creating value through performance and strategy, and providing accountability on its performance to its owners and other stakeholders. And that's going to be through the appropriate systems of internal control and risk management. And what I've been emphasising in the last few minutes of discussion is how the board of directors, this board of directors here, is the central thing. And if we get a good board, that's going to pretty much help all the other bits fall into place. Now, if we've got a good board, that is, we get a good balance between execs and non-executive directors, then the executives here, they're going to be held in account for their performance. We're going to have good interrogation of their performance, the management reports that are submitted to the board, the scrutiny of their reward system, and normally that is taken and controlled by the non-executives. And that's going to, and we'll look at that later. That's going to be through the remuneration committee. Remuneration committees of the board normally comprise all independent or non-executive directors. So the non-executives evaluate the performance and the reward systems for paying bonuses or incentives to the executives. So that's the structure, and the remuneration committee obviously reports to the full board on their outcomes. So we'll come back and have a look at remuneration committees later. We emphasised the role of shareholders. You know, that we've got this relationship between the board and shareholders, that the shareholders elect the board members, and you'll see a lot of discussion now about getting more power to the shareholders. Now, who are the shareholders? Shareholders, and not just your mums and dads and all your ordinary investors. Majority of shareholders today are hedge funds or international pension funds or other big financial institutions. They own most of the shares. So all of these big, what we call institutional investors, will have big stakes in most of the publicly listed companies. That's through their pension funds, national sovereign wealth funds and things like that. They are going to be holding the majority of votes when it comes to electing shareholders. So they've got the most power. Now, one of the big innovations in the last decade or so, or a couple of decades, has been the fact that historically these kind of pension funds were very passive. They just put their money in and they'd vote on a traditional management scheme. But much more in the last decade or so, we've seen these institutional investors become active and particularly pressuring companies to have good corporate governance. They hold the majority of votes, they pick the directors. If they're not happy with the directors, they kick them out. And so we've seen a lot more activism by institutional investors in the last decade or so. And I think that trend is one that's going to continue. These big pension funds and hedge funds, they all lost billions and trillions of dollars in the global financial crisis. They've got a whole pile of angry people out there who are going to be wanting to get a pension or retirement benefit in the future. They don't want these companies out there stuffing them around. They themselves get into trouble from their own constituents and investors. So we're seeing much more aggressive institutional shareholders. As I said, that's a real big change, that instead of just sort of leaving up to the market, so the market will fix it up, the institutional investors have real power, and we've got associations of institutional investors and various other groups now, and they take an active role in pushing for good corporate governance. And that's probably, as much as any of the legislative powers going on out there by governments, probably this force of change in the financial markets has been one of the key drivers for change. So in terms of looking at where we're heading in terms of corporate governance, we talked about, from an accounting point of view, financial disclosure and reporting, and now we've got sustainability reports and ESG reports and all sorts of other things. But, you know, good quality information and disclosure, timely, efficient disclosure. We talked about right at the beginning board leadership as being essential, and how the board's structured and operates, how that is managed through risk management, and then communication, critically communication to the market, to the stock market, and also communication through the media. So companies now are, they're all, you know, for a long time been very sophisticated in communicating their messages to both government, to the general public, and things like that. So they all have very sophisticated communication strategies to get their messages out, to position their company, whether they're taking over other companies or whatever aspect they're trying to do. They're trying to sort of get support for their strategic directions and their activities. So when we break these down under reporting processes, we've got a few points here I've just put down. First one, the accountability and reporting cycle. We see, we know companies that produce more information generally are better performers. So we know that there's mandatory information and voluntary information. We've got a lot of research that's reported in your textbook. That supports every time companies generally produce more information, voluntary information, it's a signal. And so we talked about signalling theory, that we've got better performance. So that's pretty, there's again a strong cycle that's associated with good governance, good disclosure, more transparency, more information, as well as timeliness. So companies who report on time generally have good news. If you report late, it's just normally bad news. You know, nobody wants to have, if you've got good news, you tell everybody, oh, we made our profit, we're 10% ahead of its target. Everyone go, oh yeah, market's up, everyone's happy. You've got bad news, oh, better wait till 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, everyone's asleep. We'll put it out the end of the week or at the last possible day. Hopefully no one will notice, you know. Wait till a big football final's on or something. Okay, we'll have that, and nobody will listen. But we know bad news comes late, normally tries to get buried at the end of the day. So there's a lot of information in the time and nature of things, you know, as well as the actual content of the message. We're going to talk about audit committee later, and also external auditor. And I've talked to you about transparency. I've spent a lot of time talking to you about board. I probably will go through it maybe a little bit more, but I've covered most of those things. So the core thing that I've found in working with board members and talking to companies is its composition. Now, although I'm a big fan of diversity, and I think we probably might be better off having more women on boards, I don't think you get there by legislating, by just saying, here, you've got to do it. That's not going to solve the problem. But we need to have a board that works well. It's not much good having, you know, 5 women on the board if they hate 5 men. They're not going to ever get any good. You're going to have divided board and conflict, etc., etc. So you need people that are all thinking along the same wavelength. Doesn't really matter about their gender, race, religion, or whatever. As long as people are thinking the same way, they're working together. That's the core message, okay? So how does the board, does it reflect all of the aspects of the business? Have they got expertise? That's the core thing. Can we, you know, it's like the football team. Have we got a goalkeeper? Have we got a forward? Have we got a fullback? Have we got all the positions covered? The same in the board. Have we got some legal knowledge? Have we got some technical knowledge? Have we got some industry knowledge? Have we got financial knowledge? Have we got all the different bases covered that the board should have? Got that working, got everybody working together, then you've got a good board, you've got a good checks and balances, so the chairperson of a board is respected, but can also be challenged, you know, so that they have to defend their point of views and things like that. We've got talked about balance between the executives and the culture and operations of the board. And so there's a lot of researchers now looking at that. It's sometimes very hard because these are normally confidential meetings. Companies are dealing with all their strategic issues and things like that in the board. So you can't actually go in there and say, oh, I just want to listen to what you're saying, you know. But there's been a few people who've gone in there to try and monitor how much discussion gets had on particular items, how they're processed, trying to measure some of these sorts of variables to see how robust the discussions are. And we always know, and it's fairly common human frailty, and we see this in Parliament. If someone's going to discuss something very trivial, like, the Prime Minister falls over, or something like that.
Yeah. That's
Okay, I just made it because it's on the news. But that's
Yeah.
fairly true and not going to affect anything. They might spend hours talking about some trivial thing because everyone can relate to, you fall over, you're bad or whatever the case is. People generally like to talk about small things. What's the weather like? What's this like? Oh, by the way, what's the future of the world? Oh, don't worry about that, So when the company has big strategic decisions, big investments, got hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, we get a new ashtray, yes. We spend $1 billion, yes, tick. So do we spend the right amount of time balancing up things, and how do we analyse things? So these are interesting issues. And a lot of indirect research shows that people spend more time worrying about small, trivial things that they can normally understand. When there are really big issues, like very complex, people just go over them fairly quickly. Oh, yeah, that looks all okay. It's a 500-page report on a $20 trillion investment. Well, that's okay. We'll tick that off. So that's one of the issues in the way in which boards operate, manage, practice their performance. So getting all those things right is really critical. Okay, we'll have a break after this one. Talked about risk management. You've covered a lot of this stuff, internal control, and then I talked about the communication stuff. Again, first thing, the director, the key thing for most CEOs and chair, or particularly chair people, and I'll sort of follow this a bit. They got a new company listings, new programs. What do? They go on a road show, the road trip, the old investor road trip. So the chairman of the company normally leaves Australia, goes to New York and London. They want to talk to investors. They're communicating all the time with the financial markets. So good company CEOs are expert communicators, as well as company chair, because they have to sell that company to investors. That's their job. So they go off with their investment strategy team and want to be able to position and report that company and build confidence in the market. So enormous resources and time are devoted to communication for successful corporations. Now, do anyone have any questions at this stage? You're going to be a good CEO? Yeah, you think so? Good. You'll be the chairman? Yeah? Okay. You should have a break. If you've got no questions, I'm not going to keep talking. You get 10 minutes. Is that enough? Or do you want a bit longer? 10 enough? Okay. I'll come back here. I'm going to go and get myself a coffee. You guys right?
Yeah, it's alright.
Okay.
Yeah, 70, 71.
Oh, that's good, because
Yeah,
you
yeah.
never go higher than
Yeah,
it never gets 50
never.
like others.
Don't worry about that, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, send email. Did you check the email?
No, I didn't
Oh,
check.
okay.
That's
Oh, I've already sent email.
Thank you. So then will we have a chance to read it through?
Huh, sorry?
When will you have a chance to read it through? Like,
Oh,
no, like when will you have, when? When will you have time to read it through? Like next week or something?
next week, probably.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Just asking. we are having a week off before the exam, don't we?
2 weeks?
Or 2 weeks? Is it 2 weeks?
I think it's 2 weeks. Is it?
Okay, maybe, I don't know.
2 weeks. I thought it's 2 weeks.
Yeah.
For example, at the end of November, right?
Yeah, November
2 weeks.
26th.
I thought it's 2 weeks.
So it's 2 weeks, okay.
Can't do anything.
It's good, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Just fast, so fast.
And he was part of the contract, so he got paid faster. He got the truck, through that, the more he got paid. So even if you took the toilet, 1.3, you can then run out this truck. The whole, I did that for 5 days, I was so exhausted, that's it. $11 an hour, killing myself. I said, that's it, no more, I've got to get things paid.
Drawing nonsense and he's looking at me like what? Just I'm like, oh. My eyes are like closing up.
Yeah, me too.
Gosh. I don't know what he will get in the exam.
Yes.
It's just such a notice. I think he's not even talking about that slides, he's talking in general.
Yeah. I don't know how to concentrate, how to get the main form.
Because, yeah, there's no, everything is just like that.
I don't know how we cope with all the
Are you
double
reading it?
sizes.
Are you reading this?
I read, but just, I don't know, say so much.
I haven't touched this book. I haven't touched this book because I read the second chapter and it just was just too much and about everything, you know?
I just read it when I do the assignment.
No, I was just using all the slides and, you know, databases, that's all I use. I've got so many sources for my assignment. Just amazing.
You got the note for assignment one already?
For which one?
It's a good.
No. Did you? No, not yet because I submitted it on Friday night.
I submit on
Thursday?
on Saturday.
On Saturday? This Saturday?
Yeah.
Because I submitted on Friday night like at 12.
I'm not sure about it because I don't know what I write, just answer, but I don't have
That's
something
what
to
I
submit.
did.
Yeah.
And I'm just right, it's just general thing, okay, everybody's self-oriented and blah, 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 okay, what I should write next? Okay, these ones again, self-oriented, blah, blah, and I just, like databases, I just put so many sources, like
Yeah, me too.
10 sources
That's
or
okay,
something.
I don't know how it's.
Yeah, and like, and he, like, Yon, he doesn't put the resubmission, he doesn't allow resubmission, so we cannot check.
Yes, but-
Exam presentation, something?
Oh, hundreds, yeah, no, not hundreds, but there should be 30 or 40. That should all. So that's, from, Friday the 2nd. We will have, campus,
So I know you will finish all the teaching next
you do?
Monday?
Yeah.
Yeah, next Monday, and then I can go. Yeah, I can